That's every diver's dream. When I was a kid, before I could even swim, I was dreaming about finding chests filled with treasure. And there is a lot of it down there, and a lot of it's right here in Brevard County or in Indian River County to the south. And those coins all came up by SebastianInlet, which we call the cabin site, which I'll get into. And over the years, it's just a guess, but I think we brought up about 200,000 pieces of 8. And also, nobody seems to know how much gold, because when divers find the gold, they usually steal half of them, so we don't know how many we found. And then I get a call from an antique shop or a jeweler saying, tell me more about this coin, and so it's quite interesting. It all started for me in the archives of the Indies in Seville. And I spent 4.5 years of my life in that archives, living in Seville. And at the same time, I would dive on weekends in Cadiz Bay, which is where a lot of these galleons left from on the way coming to the New World. And I got fascinated right from the very beginning. First off, the archives is behind us. This was called the Tower of Gold. And in the old days, all the gold coming back from the New World, which of course came right through our straits, right past Cape Canaveral, Azores, and then into Spain, and then up the river. They either row it up, tow it up, or small enough in the 16th century, the boats could sail up there. So that was called the Tower of Gold, where all the gold was brought and then minted. Unfortunately, the treasure from the New World, contrary that most people believe, it was best described by a Doge of Venice one time. It was like raindrops. As quick as they brought it back from the New World, they had so many wars going on that they needed to use the money for mercenaries and other reasons. And like raindrops, it just disappeared. So Spain, even though in the 16th century it was considered the richest nation in the world, it really wasn't, because of all these wars, doing exploration in the Philippines and every place. But my baptism was there at the Tower of Gold diving. 2 little kids fell in the water and drowned, so they asked me to get the bodies. And while I was down on the bottom, I found all kind of treasure while looking for the kids in the mud. So that was my first thing. The work in the archives of the Indies, believe it or not, I had to be a gentleman and wear a tie. But the only time, except when I was a Marine, did I ever wear a tie. I don't wear ties. And so before I went to the archives in Spain, I went to Western Ontario, and lived in a lodge with a bunch of meese, beavers, wild bears, big black bears, and all kind of stuff like that. And I had a portable microfilm reader because everybody said, you can't read Old Spanish. It's a lost language. It's a combination of Basque from northwest Spain, Catalan from Barcelona and the Balearic Islands, Moro because of the Moors being in Grenada and all those places, Latin, Portuguese, all mixed up, written phonetically. By phonetically means the way the guy heard the sound who was a scribe, he would write it that way. In some cases, they had like 6 pages without a comma or a period. So it was like a jigsaw puzzle. But when I also got there, they also told me, don't try to read the correspondence dealing with embassies, Spanish embassies like in London or in other places, or anything to do with the Catholic Church, because they had a code. And nobody's ever broken a code. Well, I decided I was going to tackle that the first thing. And I know that the king, whenever he would make a document in his name, like it was called a royal cedula, a royal law, it always started out with, I the king of the Sicilies. Sicily was part of Spain, of Naples, which was a separate country, part of Spain, the Philippines and all this, the Marianas and on and on. By the grace of God, boom, boom, boom. So I knew that this had to be the code that was on these documents because it was all numbers. And after a couple of months, I figured it out. I was doing other stuff, reading the other documents. They kept telling me, Marx, you're nuts. Anyhow, I broke the code. So while I was there, I used to be a blonde. That's until one of those sharks that I wrote about in all my writings that sharks don't bite. One didn't read my books and my articles, and one bit me, and 6 months later, that was in Bahamas. The next one got me in Brazil. So while I was in the archives, I read this document. This is Prince Philip V, who died without an heir, and it means no bambino, to take over the country. So that started the War of Spanish Succession, where all the different countries in Europe decided their prince or their whatever should be the new king of Spain. And it was going pretty bloody over there, that going on. So finally the Pope intervened, and the Pope says, I'll make a Bourbon. Remember, up until that time, all the kings of Spain were Habsburgs because of, from the time of Columbus, and they were all from Austria, of course. And now we have a French king, and he's a Bourbon, and that's why the kings of Spain ever since are called, like Juan Carlos, who had to abdicate recently and dropped the office for his own son. He was Juan Carlos de Bourbon y Bourbon. So the Bourbon are still in. But anyhow, so that he wouldn't die, this new king of Spain, without a bambino to take over and succeed him, the Pope decided to pick a queen for him. And so he picked Maria de Savoia, also known as Elizabeth Farnese. She had 3 different titles. Savoy was a separate country at that time. For 150 years, Savoy, which is the westernmost province today in Italy, ran all of Italy. I mean, owned it for 850 years. So anyhow, she's made queen, and her family decides she needs a big dowry. And here's a picture of her. So the dowry consisted of about 1,500 pieces of treasure, all handmade, had to be made in the Orient. So about 300 or 400 of those were tiaras, and every single one was different. All of them gold, but every one set with different stones, different bracelets, etc. And then, of course, there was church plate for her own private chapel. And so she wouldn't consummate the marriage. Meanwhile, everybody in court's going crazy. If this king dies and doesn't have an heir, we're in big trouble. But meanwhile, she wouldn't do it, you know. She said, no, I want my dowry. So they had to send word from Spain all the ways to Veracruz, overland the mountains to Acapulco, send them a Manila galleon to make all of these jewels. And it wasn't until 1706, the first stack of these gold, it's called the Queen's Jewels, came back. And it got to Veracruz. A fleet left Veracruz, and they stupidly put all of Queen's jewels on the Capitana of the fleet. And of course, it sunk in a hurricane in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. All the Queen's jewels are lost. Meanwhile, the court's going crazy. You know, the Queen's not making herself available is the best way I could put it, so I don't get a lecture later on. My wife's here. Well, the Queen's not putting that, is what I'm saying. So they did it again. They had to get all these things made, and most of them were made, the jewels were made in Macau, but like the diamonds came from India, the sapphires came from Burma, the emeralds came from Siam, which is Thailand today, and on and on. So again, 1711 comes, they loaded it up in Veracruz to go back to Spain. The ship's going to stop in Havana before it comes up the channel out here, the Bahama Channel, and it sunk in another hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Now we don't have any Queen's jewels. Big trouble. So the third attempt was in 1715, and that's what we're talking about, celebrating next year. And the third attempt actually weathered a couple bad storms, lost a few ships on the way to Havana, and then it was a small fleet compared with a lot of fleets. There were a lot of fleets that used to sail with like 100 ships, 200 ships going back to Spain. This was a small one, somewhere between 12 and 14 ships. All the documents differ. And in the meantime, her family made a deal with the Spanish crown that she would consummate the marriage if they would give Spain all of Naples. That's the whole kingdom of Naples, which was at that time 1/3 of Italy. All of this, give Sicily also away, which is a pretty big island, and some other things like that. And in return, she would do it. But she died on childbirth, so she never got to see the jewels when they finally got back. Well, they didn't really get back, but sort of. So here's some of the jewels found by a guy who's not here, unfortunately, today, Chris James. And as you could see, these are the earrings. That could be the Queen's jewels. I'd say chances are 9 out of 10. This thing here has like 400 diamonds in it. It's about this big, and that's probably part of the Queen's jewels. And then this one also, there was probably something in the middle there, and it could have been a big, like, who knows, a huge diamond, a huge something. So this also, this gold crucifix with emeralds on it, and the gold box and the gold chains also could be part of the Queen's jewels, but we don't know exactly. A couple kids about 15 years ago were looking for lobsters off of where John's Island is down south, or where Windsor, the development there. And they stumbled on this gigantic platter about this big, solid gold. And unfortunately, they talked too much, and the state found out, and of course, the state not only wanted 20%, which they were entitled to by law, they wanted the whole thing. So they gave the kids who were only 15, 16, the equivalent of $100,000 in gold coins, but the kids got really ripped off. The charts in the old days, as you could see, were very, very primitive. That's Cape Canaveral right there, if you can believe it. That's the Bahamas. So consequently, over the years, 2,200 galleons, meaning ships carrying treasure, that left Havana, which would be, I'm sorry, oh God. Left Havana, were lost on the coast of Florida. But we got to be careful with that word Florida, because in the 16th and 17th century, La Florida was everything from the Tampico River, which is on the border with Mexico, Texas, all the ways to Virginia. Only after the British came over and settled in Virginia and all that, then Florida, they became what it is. And this particular wreck in the Queen's Jewels is very special to me, because my wife, who's here, half of her family came from Menorca, the smaller island. I spend most of my time in Mallorca or Ibiza when I go over. And in Mallorca, in 1505, a member of her family, which is Parpals, P-A-R-P-A-L, spelled a couple other ways, the guy invented what was called the diving machine. And basically it was a diving bell where you sat inside, took a breath, swam out, got the goodies, swam back in, and then it usually had a canary inside the bell and a candle, so that when you got carbon dioxide in there from rebreathing the same air, the canary either peeled over or the candle went out, and then you knew it was time to haul it, man, get some more air. So either they lowered lead drums with more air that you put into the chamber, or they free dived down and gave you a hose to put in there. So her family ties into this. I was doing a series with Japanese television, and we were in Cadiz Bay that I mentioned before. I spent a lot of my life diving over there. And they were filming me, and they said, and I'd tell them how much treasure's in Cadiz Bay, and they said, hey, how do you know there's any treasures left? I says, I know there's a lot left, but I says, lots and lots of people have been working here looking for treasures for centuries. Well, then there's nothing left. I said, oh yeah. Then I mentioned about my wife's family, the Parpals. So when we got to the archives in Madrid, the Navy archives, I found documents, and the documents more or less give the clue that now, after all these years of trying to figure out where the Queen's jewels, there's a couple things against it. First off, Remember, there was no Sebastian Inlet. There was latitude, but latitude was only good within 10, 15 miles. There was no longitude. Even the depths of waters are a little hazy because everything, when a fathom was a distance from here to here. But if you're a small guy and you got the line up, it's smaller. If you're a big Viking with big arms, it was bigger. So even when you got depths, and then when they got into measurements, I hate to tell you, a cannon shot. Well, some cannons could fire a ball a couple hundred yards only, and other cannonballs could fire 3 miles, depending on the type of cannon. So a lot of that stuff is, up for debate exactly. So when I came here 48 years ago, part of my goal was to find the Queen's jewels. So that's done at Sebastian. And for years I worked on at Sebastian. But here it gives you an idea. Here's Cape Canaveral. Sebastian's right about here. And here's the Bahamas over there, Grand Bahama Island. And here's other wrecks over here on the Bahama Bank. So the ships used to come right up here. And notice out here in Canaveral, centuries ago, there used to be islands out there. They're since, got eroded away either from currents or from hurricanes. And then they would go, I don't know what I'm doing here. They would go from there to the Azores and then into Spain with the treasures. These treasures started out, most of the gold and silver started out, about 60% came out of Peru and Chile and Ecuador. Another 35% came out of Mexico and Guatemala, and about 5% came out of a few other places like Ecuador and Panama. So most of the treasures came through Panama. And in Panama, the first port was Nombre de Dios, or name of God. And that was on the Caribbean side. And remember, every year, hundreds of ships went into there, picking up the treasures from South America and also dropping off everything from wine to saddles. There was restrictions. The merchants in Seville did not want people in the New World making their own wine, so you couldn't grow wine over here. They also had a monopoly on olive oil. No Spaniard in his right mind would have a meal without olive oil. And the same with saddles. They didn't want people over here making leather goods, so all leather goods had to come through Seville at exorbitant rates. So anyhow, in the case of Nombre de Dios, it was a very, very important port. And at times there were as many as 150 galleons in there waiting to go back to the old world with the treasures from South America. And it was pretty cool until 1587, Sir Francis Drake went there, and when he didn't find any treasure like he expected, he had raided the place 3 years before, and he found this silver bar, which you all could see later. It's 80 pound from the Atocha that one of my friends brought in here. The guy who's actually found more treasure on the 1715 fleet than anybody. He's here. Before, he's been working there for like 45 years on this fleet here. Anyhow, the first time Drake hit the place, there was no warning that he was around. And so merchants who were with him from Venice and some other countries, so we don't have to listen to just Englishmen lying about his accomplishments, but all these other people told that there was a pile 150 feet long, 12 foot wide, and about 6 to 8 feet high, just as silver bars from Peru, Chile, and Ecuador. So you could see. Now this guy goes back some years later, and they got warning that Drake was on the loose, so they managed to hide all the treasure. So he burnt the place to the ground, and after that, Nombre de Dios no longer existed. Today it's just ruins. I've been there a number of times. Potosi is the mine in Peru. Today Potosi is actually in Bolivia, but in the old days, that was the richest gold and silver mine in the world. And over the years, tons and tons of treasure came out of there. And unfortunately, the mine shafts are pretty deep. and slave labor had to be used. So mainly they brought over Negroes from Africa, brought over by the Portuguese, because when the Pope divided the earth in two, the west coast of Africa belonged to Portugal. So they brought the slaves over, and they had to be used in the mines, and because of cave-ins and other problems in the mines. Here's a good example. This is what Potosi looks like in all the different levels. Sometimes they mine these treasures as far down as a half a mile into the earth. So you could see, figure the air, how bad it was and all that. So here's Potosi today. I went there about 25 years ago. Still looks like the drawing from the 16th century. And now, where they had a mint there at Potosi, I went in the garden. This was, I said, some years ago. It was actually in the late 50s. Yeah. And there was a garden outside the mint. There was no tourism or anything. And where gardeners had been weeding, I went looking around, and I found like 20 silver coins that had no value to these people. So that's my experience. In the early days, they had alchemists, of course. Everybody had a solution for the gold and silver. So before Columbus discovered America, or as I said, rediscovered it because other people got here before him, all these alchemists spent fortunes trying to make gold. Here's coming down from the mines of Potosi, from Potosi to Callao, which is the port of Lima today, but at that time was also where all the silver came down. And because they didn't have too many pack mules, they were using, what's those animals? Yeah, thanks. Unfortunately, when Pizarro, who's riding the horse there, first got there, they got all of the gold from all the temples, the Inca temples, and they decided to melt it down into silver bars. A few pieces survived, and today it's in a historical museum in Vienna, because remember, this is during the period of the Habsburgs. When Cortez got to what's Mexico City today and met Montezuma, the same thing, he demanded all the gold and silver, and of course, these guys gave it up, and then later on he kills Montezuma. There's gold all over, and this is from Panama. We found these in a lake of a volcano in Panama, working for the organization American States, meaning pro bono, meaning I didn't get a percentage. And we found 330 of these little things. And some years later, National Geographic comes along and says, we're doing a story on Panama and also the pre-Columbian part of Panama, and we need you and your wife to go there, Jennifer, who's sitting there, down there, with all of the goodies, all these gold, they're called huacas. People who dig for them on land graves are called huaqueros. The graves that they're in are called huacas, and the artifacts are called huacas. Now you learn a word there. So we go back down for this geographic shoot, and guess what? Not a single one of the 330 were left. They didn't know what happened to them. This is the National Museum of Panama. Years go by, and I'm working on a Hollywood movie, and I get invited to a party, and I got invited to have chow at Vincent Price, the spooky actor. I didn't like spooky movies, but I knew that he had a great pre-Columbian collection of art. So I was happy to go to his house. All 330 were in shadow boxes on the wall. He had bought them from the government, the people who ran a museum down there. So you can't trust anybody these days. Okay, I'm always getting asked about pieces of eight. At one time we had a museum, as you know, at Port Canaveral. We opened it in '68, and it was the Real 8 Museum of Sunken Treasure. And this was one of the displays that I had in the museum, different kinds of coins. But you could see they were made into a bar and chopped in pieces, as you see in this middle thing. Oh. Okay. There was the trail. When he brought the treasures up from South America and got them to Panama City, they had him get them across the isthmus. And during the dry season, they used a thing called the Camino Real, the Royal Road, on mules But the trail was so narrow that, you know, if you slipped, the mules slipped on one side, and they all carried 300 to 400 pounds of silver ingots or coins or chests of coins. Anyhow, along that trail, one of my things with the organization American States, another pro bono, you can see the coins that I found there, which are interesting because a couple of them were made in Spain, and how they ended up on this trail, I don't know, unless somehow somebody brought them over. And I only found one gold coin on that particular day. Okay, on the coins, they made 8 escudo, also known as a doubloon for most people, and that's 1 ounce of gold. And then they made a 4 escudo, which is a ½ ounce, a 2 and a 1, and sometimes a half. And here's one right here. You can see on the top left, the L is for Lima, Peru, 8 reales, piece of 8. Potosi Mint right here. No, that's Plus Ultra. That means the overseas empire of the King of Spain. And there's a date, I think, 1708. So those are from the cabin site. Then they also made what was called excelentes. Before I got here, and I first got involved with this 1715 fleet in 1959 when I was still living in Cozumel Island. Kip Wagner came down and brought some of the treasure that he had found on the beach, and asked me, what is this junk, and on and on and on, which he always found when he was looking for driftwood. That's before he got a metal detector. Anyhow, somehow he named these pieces royals. Well, if you know Spanish, every piece of 8 is a royal. It's called an 8 reale. Real means royal. So these are misnamed. And this shows you the routes that I was talking about going home. Everything started, we got this stuff. Here's Portobello, which replaced Nombre de Dios. From Cartagena was lots of gold and lots of emeralds. And from over here, we got all the pearls. And then the route was going up this way to Havana and then up the coast. Then we had the New Spain fleet, which went every year from Spain to either Guadeloupe, Martinique, or one of the Dominica. It would take on water and supplies there and then go to Veracruz. And that's the one that would wait in Veracruz, winter there because of the bad northers that blow in the Gulf of Mexico, and wait there for the Manila galleons, which was the last lecture I had here. The Manila galleons came over and then dropped the treasure in Acapulco. It had to go on the mules overland to Veracruz. So that's the New Spain fleet. But notice, because the winds are... Jesus. We need a better guy here. Because the winds are from the east, blowing this way, when they left Veracruz, they couldn't go the easy way this way, no. They had to go right all the way up to the mouth of the Mississippi River and then down, past the dry Tortugas right there, into Havana, and then diddy-bop back. Here's a good idea of where I was talking about Nombre de Dios. Nombre de Dios is right in here. Over here. Oh no, here's Nombre de Dios right here. And then Portobello's over here. And you could see the way the fleets went back. And here's coming up from South America. And here's what Portobello looked like about 40 years ago when I first went there. And when I first went there were more forts than today. All the forts have been stripped down by the Panama Canal people and used to repair the canal. And now they're making it wider. They're probably going to destroy. At one time, there were 18 forts in Portobello. And the reason was, you had sometimes 200 ships or more waiting to go back to Spain. But first, when they left here, they went to Cartagena, then Havana, and then back. And the waters in the places are pretty deep. But I did a lot of diving there and found a lot of stuff there. This is at Portobello where they had a fair. Now they're bringing all that treasure up, but they're also bringing the products I told you from the old world over, the saddles and the wine and the olive oil. So they had a fair that lasted so many days, sometimes weeks, and then they brought the treasure. When the guy decided the fair was over, in the 16th century, they had much better ships. And later on, when they made the galleons bigger, like this is what the galleon at Sebastian or the cabin site looked like. Very, very good thing. So what happened was we got the Queen's jewels on the thing finally in 1715. It leaves Havana on a way going up. I told you 12 to 14 ships. We got differing accounts of how many. And then it gets hit with the hurricane. And contrary to what a lot of people believe, ships didn't really sink. They wrecked. Sinking means you go right to the bottom. Wrecking means, you're going to go up on a beach or you're going to go up on a reef or going up on the rocks. And usually when they knew they were in shallow water, using a sounding lead to see how deep they were, they would start dropping the anchors. Now that's bad for the modern treasure hunter, many of which are sitting here, because the fine old wrecks, we mainly find them by finding the iron. On most of them, they had iron cannons. Always the anchors are iron. But if you see the beach is a quarter mile ahead, and a giant waves and a storm's throwing you up there, you're dropping the anchors. The only reason you wreck is the anchor lines all break. So it's easy to find the anchors, but they're usually a long ways from where the wreck went up on the beach. And then rich wrecks had bronze cannons. And in this case, the bronze cannons on the cabin site, or let's call it, it's also known as the Capitana. It's known as the cabin site because our old company, we used to have a cabin on the beach where we could swim out and work on the wreck. And on the cabin site, wait 1 second. Oh, here we go. It's rare to have an idea what a ship looked like. For thousands of ships that sunk, there's no paintings, there's no drawings, there's no nothing. But in the case of the cabin site, it turns out the ship was originally a Dutch ship where we got plans on how it was built, captured by the British and named the Mammoth. And then the Spaniards got it and named it. The name's about that long. It's got Jesus, Santa Maria, Joseph. Let's just call it the cabin site. And we had a museum up at Port Canaveral, which we opened up the day that Armstrong, the guys who walked on the moon, I forgot. Huh? Yeah. We opened the museum then and had all kind of great displays in the museum, etc. And on the top it showed the routes, which I showed you on an earlier slide there. And today it's a porno museum. But when you go in, you can still see my map on the ceiling. But it doesn't have treasure except how do you find treasure? The main thing we look for when we're looking for a wreck are the ballast stones, which are the round, some people call them river pebbles. They're always round. And in some cases, when a ship had so many people on it, they didn't use ballast. They actually used kegs of water and wine and olive oil, etc. And as they used it up on the voyage, then they refilled those things. Here's what I was talking about on the diving bell. And in this case, see the guys inside there? This is open here. Here they're letting down another keg of fresh air, pure air going in. Here's a guy who was in the bell. He's out with a hose in his mouth in some cases. In some cases they made actual helmets out of pigskin with the mouthpiece going into it. But anyhow, it was a dangerous profession going out there, and that's what the Perpals, they were divers for the kings of Spain, and they dove every place. And when I was working at Port Royal, the sunken city in Jamaica, down on Pedro Shoals, 4 galleons went wrecked there in 1694. And it's so funny, I went down there working on it for the Jamaican government, and years later I find out my wife's ancestors worked on those same wrecks. The same thing in Panama on the Caribbean side. 3 wrecks I worked there, the family. So they used to get shipped by the King of Spain wherever he lost the most valuable ships and try to find the treasures. The earliest divers just held their breath. And the first divers that we had in the New World were from the Bahamas, or at that time it was known as the Lucayas, and those were Indians. And the first ones were sent down soon after the time of Columbus, and they worked off of Isla Margarita and Cuba Agua, 2 islands off the coast of Venezuela, not far from Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. And they would hold their breath, go down a line, and they broke their earlobes with a pin so they didn't have the problem of clearing their ears going up and down. And the funniest story about these divers, after first the Lucayas got exterminated by overworked, worked 7 days a week from sun up to sundive, then they brought slaves from Africa, and the same thing, those were better divers, and they all came from Angola mainly, and they came over holding their breath and all that. And on the cabin site, we're back to the cabin site, or the Capitana, after the ship first was lost, they brought some of the same divers up from Margarita Island to dive on these wrecks. And at the end of the day, each slave was paid as many pieces of bait that he could stick in his mouth. So he actually got paid for recovering treasure. Sometimes we don't have that happen even today. There's your royal that we were talking about, better known as the Excellente piece. There are a lot of documents on the fleet, but see, here's information that's wrong. Right there, the fleet was lost in 1715, not 17, oh, here it is, 15, yeah. A lot of documents say 1716, and there you have 14 in number. Some documents say 12, some say even 11. Bleach yard is because of all the bones from shipwrecks of people ended up on the beach, so they called it bleach yard. Your bones got bleached from the sun. This is an interesting cannon. A guy who's long passed away found it right near the cabin site. And so we know the cabin site, in case you don't. It's 2.5 miles south of SebastianInlet, right where the McClarty Museum is. And the director of the McClarty Museum is here, and he'll be passing out brochures because this is a very important event for them next year, the celebration. But right south of the cabin site, where all the treasures came up, a couple 100 yards, we call it Amber Beach, A-M-B-E-R Beach, and it's the parking lot there, and all the detector guys are down there always playing around. This particular cannon came up, and it's interesting because it's a 16th century, early 16th century cannon, so it has nothing to do with the 1715. So I was suspicious at first. And the story is, right on that beach there at Amber Beach, over the years we have found hundreds and hundreds of Santo Domingo coins from Santo Domingo from the early 1500s. So this ties in with that. So what I'm talking about, there are wrecks on top of wrecks on top of wrecks. It's just a matter of sorting them out and trying to find out the stuff. Here's an aerial, and McClarty Museum is right here, right there. Here's the site, and these 2 lagoons. At one time, there was 1 lagoon when I first went there. We had a period when it was so rough we couldn't dive on the cabin site back in the early 70s. So I decided maybe some part of the wreck would come overland and end up in that lagoon. And my divers thought, well, I was crazy, But get your rubber suits, let's get your snorkel equipment. And we worked in one little tiny corner. And in one day, we found more than 900 Spanish silver coins, just digging in the mud with our hands. And so today, I don't know how to get a permit to do it or not. And then this shows you, oh my God. the reefs. Most of the treasure that's been brought up in modern times has come out of this area here, from like 3 feet to 15 feet. That's the first reef. There's a second reef. And then out here, it's about 30 feet deep. Where's the Queen's jewels? I'm not about to tell anybody, but I now have all the information from the Spanish documents where it is. But we first got to convince Spain, who now owns all Spanish shipwrecks, no matter where, when, and how lost. You know, let's have a little division of treasure here, spoils. So, as you know, when these wrecks came, well, there was an old beachcomber, a guy who built houses at Patrick for Air Force people, building contractor, named Kip Wagner. And in his early days, he used to collect driftwood to make lamps and furniture out for people. It was his kind of hobby. And then a couple of times when he was playing around, he found these black things on the beach, which happened to be pieces of 8. And he didn't know what they were. He'd skip them across the water to see how many times they could skip. Then one day he scratched one, and the saw was kind of silverish, and he took them home and used to melt them down for toy soldiers for the neighborhood kids. Then later on in life, he got a little smarter when he started finding the gold. So he knew it was a fleet out there, and he got involved with. Anyhow, this is his wife at that time. Now, how did that Chinese porcelain, Kongxi porcelain, survive? Because when they shipped it from the Orient on those Manila galleons, they, like that cup you see, there'd be a cup, soft clay, straw, more soft clay, push the cups together, you'd have a thing that long. Then they wrapped that whole thing in burlap in soft clay. So almost dozens and dozens of these intact pieces of porcelain we pulled out in my days and before from, this is on the cabin site, wreck area, and you can see where the G is, that's where gold was found, the ballast and timbers, and jewels, treasure map. I bet somebody's taking a picture right now. Well, we got Mel Fisher involved. Mel was working, I knew him in California, and we used to dive, believe it or not, on mysterious Manila galleons. He had a dive shop in Redondo Beach, and he liked to get people to put up money to go look for a galleon. But it turns out the galleon that he said was a Manila galleon turned out to be an early 1800 wreck. But these people didn't know. They were too dumb to know anything better. They just wanted to say, I dove on a galleon. So that's Mel. So we got Mel to come out here, and he came out here, put a team together, and what he really did was open up the whole field of shipwreck exploration, because prior to this, when the water was dirty, you couldn't see anything. So Mel came up with this thing to build what we call blasters or prop washers, and that would suck the water from the surface and put it on the bottom where you were working. Well, then they discovered by accident that this thing also blew the sand away. So instead of down there with your hand trying to do it and dig a hole, suddenly we had, thanks to Mel, the blaster. Mel also was funny because he used to dream about treasure. And then in this particular incident, we knew that coins were coming ashore at Douglas Beach, about 3 miles south of the Fort Pierce Inlet. Gold coins were coming up all the time. So he knew there was a wreck out there. And he gave it 1 year and 1 day, and then he was going to go back to California if he didn't strike it rich. And on the very last day, they were out there getting ready to go out and drag the magnetometer and dig some holes and try to find something. And he looks out and he sees a rainbow, and that's it. The pot of gold's under the rainbow. So he sends a boat, because remember, if you go with your boat, the rainbow's going to move. But he sent the boat out with a walkie-talkie, and he kept saying, get closer, drop the anchor, there's the pile of gold. Everybody thought he was crazy, but that when they dug there, I think altogether, Brandon, you could tell me better, you were there. Was it 1,000 coins, gold?
About 1,200 gold coins.
1,200. One of the guys who helped find it is sitting right there. At that time, he was 16 years old. Now he's not as old as me, but he's old. Gotcha, Brandon. So the treasure chest found off of Sebastian, that's a couple of the original guys right there. And here's some clumps. That's my old boat, the Griffon. Now, why do we like coins when they're in clumps? Simple. The ones on the outside are sulfided, but if you drop it, and that's not archaeology, you're supposed to spend 3 days in a week opening the thing up gently, and taking pictures every 3 seconds, and on and on. But if nobody's looking, you throw it up in the air, you let it hit the bloody deck, man, all the coins inside, the silver coins, are shiny like the day. And because of all the smuggling that they did in the old days, you'd find gold inside a lot of these clumps also. There's my wife, Jennifer, picking up some gold and silver if you look good. Right. And this was another local diver that we had here. So we used to think in the late 60s when I got here, and the early 70s, if we didn't have 3 buckets of coins, usually silver, that it was a bad day. And so there was so much treasure out there, you couldn't believe it. Jim Rathman, who was Rathman Chevrolet Rosner today, for you people who are new here, we had everybody involved with the wrecks down there, including Hot Lips Houlihan from MASH. She was one of the investors. We had incredible, some of the original astronauts, including a couple that got burnt on that accident on the pad, and on and on. So a lot of different people over the years have been involved. All I wanted to do is find the bloody Queen's jewels. So I always been involved with it since the 60s, trying to find the Queen's jewel, but why can't we find them? Not only because we were looking in the wrong place, which I now know, and I ain't telling you the right place, but because the metal detectors that we use, contrary to all the ads that you read, will say you could find a piece of 8 12 inches away, try about 6 inches. So if that piece of 8 is 13 inches under the sand, you don't get a reading. Unless a hurricane comes through and takes some of the sand. Well, when that happens, usually a lot of the coins end up on the beach, and people find more treasure on the beach than we do in the water. So there's a lot of problems. Well, with the Queen's jewels, since they were quite a ways out offshore, there's nothing they could find it electronic-wise. We just don't have the equipment. And there's a couple of people here who think they have found the part of the wreck. The other part, as I mentioned, the stern castle of these ships and the bow of the ships, including the cabin site wreck, were bronze cannons. The magnetometer does not find bronze, only ferrous, iron. So if you want to see what was in the bow of the cabin site, go to the San Marcos fort in St. Augustine. 6 of them were found in 1941 right on the beach, and they took them from there, the Park Service, and put them in a fort up there. Those are from the cabin site. Any that was found offshore, we're not sure what happened to them. This chain, we like to say, came from the Queen's jewels, but who knows? But what it looks like is a chain that's, I think, 12 feet long. It's got that thing there is for cleaning your teeth, believe it or not. And on the end of the dragon is a cup, and it's not for cocaine. It's for, again, cleaning your ears. And it's a whistle also, whistle. So that was found on the beach at Sebastian after a storm. Brandon, where was this found? Riamar. Down off of Riamar Golf Course in Vero Beach. And that's the Madonna there. And those pearls. If you don't get the pearls into fresh water soon, or put them in like olive oil, believe it or not, even though pearls come from the ocean, they disintegrate. And This one was a reliquary. Inside was in tempera painted. Remember, these were made in the Orient. And inside was a piece of wood, supposed to be, according to the documents, a piece of the true cross. If every piece of wood that I found in reliquaries, as these things are called, over the years, the true cross had to be 100 feet high. So some things get exaggerated. And a lot of the treasures that we found in very close to shore. And I have a Marine buddy here. I got a whole bunch of people who found treasure close to shore, but he was involved with finding a cannon down, how far from Sebastian? 10 miles south? Yeah. And it produced 60, 70 gold coins. Pretty close. I told you about the gold before. Nobody wants to tell you. This is an interesting one because in this case, I was able to trace it back to the document. This is a penknife. The iron blade disintegrated in the salt water, but the silver part has the name on it. Diego, D-E means of, Pinoloso, Y is like A-N-D, Picasso, Bizarro, right there. And I trace it, and he was a quartermaster on the galleon at Sebastian. And here's my old Griffon that I used here off the coast. And this is how the blaster works that Mel Fisher invented. We blow away the sand, and then we're down there looking, and it clears. It's sucking fresh water from the propellers, and the cage is on there so that nobody gets sucked into the propeller blade. And down underneath there, even though it's so cloudy here, that's where you find the treasure, just laying down there. Some boats have 2 blasters, and next to Brandon, who's sitting here, the guy who found the most treasure on the 1715 fleet was Mo. He was a black guy from Panama, and he came here with Mel Fisher when Mel first came here to work, before Mel ran off to find the Atocha. And I was gone someplace, and I owned 51% of the cabin site at the time, and Mel owned 49%. And when I came back, Mo said, hey, we found lots of stuff. They found gold rosaries and everything. And I said, maybe it's part of the Queen's jewels. But they found it right off the McClarty Museum. And as I said, the director of the museum is here. And they have big exhibits there and movies and stuff about the 1750. Anyhow, when I get back to show you about how treasure is hidden, Mo said, I said, you sure you guys got everything up? Oh, man, we went over the bottom with a fine tooth comb. There's nothing left, man, nothing left. I said, you know what? Meet me tomorrow. Bring a crowbar, about 1.5 inches thick, 8 feet long, very, very heavy. But being a Marine, that's not a problem. And I says, you sure you got everything? Well, the bottom has got coquina on it. And even though a metal detector could go through coquina, the coquina in some cases makes it too far from the target. So I went out there in neck-deep water with a crowbar, and here's some of the gold we found, as you could see. All that's gold. And we turned it all in. In the museum, if you go there, you'll see about how when the Spaniards were salvaging, and they got something like 900 chests, like you saw in the beginning, except some of their chests were made out of wood. Most of them were, not all metal. Usually the ones made out of metal was stuff for the king or stuff for the Catholic Church. And so they got about 900 of the 1,400 registered chests of treasure up. And they had a salvage camp ashore, and the pirate Jennings came there and captured it. And I can't remember, how does this fit in? Brandon?
1715 fleet.
I know, but I can't. Who found it and where? Okay, that's a gold snuff box, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And this is part of is any of the people from Bounty here? Booty? Well, there's a family from Stanford, and 2 years ago they found a whole bunch of gold chains and goodies, and I think it's a grandfather, grandmother, mother, father, I don't know, about 4 or 5 kids, And they went treasure hunting and went out there and found the stuff. And then this year, they found part of this gold filigree, part of a reliquary, I think. And the other part had been found like 25 years ago, right in the same area. So as you could see, even the treasures that we know right where they are, we can't always find them that easy. Part of what's interesting about Sebastian, right south of the inlet, not very far, when you see that, if you're down at the inlet and you look out, there are giant waves out there. It's known as the monster hole. And when you fly around in planes, you look down, the 5 biggest sharks ever caught in the state of Florida were all great whites. That's not a great white. Right there at Sebastian. So remember the one they were tracking last year called Elizabeth? And then went into the Gulf of Mexico. So and then we're almost done. One of the 1715 was lost 60 miles offshore from St. Augustine in 1,400 feet of water. And shrimpers dragging nets for royal pinks, which are very deep, not a lot of shrimps, 20 feet of water, 30 feet of water. They snagged into that wreck and brought up a whole bunch of copper kettles that were made originally in Andalusia. And so I found out about it, and we used a submersible right there. So you're inside there, and it's for 3,000 feet of water. Those are from Harbor Branch, which it's located halfway between Fort Pierce and Vero Beach. And it was pretty exciting working at that depth out there on finding this stuff. And here's some of the copper kettles that originally told us where the wreck is. The important part of the story is, it's a 1715 wreck. See how far they're scattered away. So the southernmost one that we know for sure is off of St. Lucie Inlet, but it's a national park there, a national seashore or something, so you can't look there, can't work there. And the furthest one is this one off of St. Augustine in deep water. And there's more stuff from the cabin site, and that's some of those rosaries I was talking about. Those rosaries came out of 3 and 4 feet of water. Okay, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And what's the future on the site? I don't know. Until something is settled with Spain, there's hardly any use to going out there. Because if you're going to bring it up and lose it to Spain, the Spanish government, no use doing it. It costs money to do all these things. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Put the lights up. So who's first?
No questions?
Did they ever say how many chests were involved with the Queen's jewels?
No. Go ahead, George.
When did you start diving?
What?
When did you start scuba diving?
I learned how to be a hard hat diver at the age of 13. There was no scuba in those days. And that's why I'm using a cane today, because I got bent so many times using a helmet. So I have bone necrosis. It means my bones are hollow. And I'm kind of like ossobuco, you hollow bones. And it wasn't until 1950 in the Marine Corps that we first got the first scuba and the first diving tables. But then I thought I was a diving god. I didn't have to die. I didn't have to mind the tables. I could get away with murder. And so I did it for years and years. And then finally I got hit pretty bad with bends. And that's it. From then on, I mind the tables, but not enough. Go ahead.
How many hours do you log underwater?
In my life?
Yes. And your next life, yes.
I'm not good at math, but I will just tell you this. At Port Royal, the sunken city in Jamaica that sunk in 1692, which I gave a lecture here last year or the year before, I think, about I worked 7 days a week because we were rushing against a dredging operation that was going to dredge the bottom up and destroy all the buildings from 1692 and all the treasures down there. And so I averaged 71 hours a week for almost 4 years. That's underwater. That doesn't mean coming up and changing scuba tanks, because I didn't use a scuba tank. I used what's called a hookah, a hose going right into my mouth so I could stay down there forever. And then no lunch, no nothing. Marines, we work hard. So the poor guys that were on the barge on the top, all the mud I'm pumping up, they're getting covered with it. The local police academy was right next door to my place where I was operating. And the police chief there at the academy, he gave my guys ganja every day. If you don't know what ganja is, I'll tell you. It's pot. So I would come in the morning at 5:30, bring in the daily newspaper, give it to my guys, and they roll spliffs, they call them. They're about that long. They took on us, and then they went out there and worked their tails off until sundown. So I don't know how you count it, because every operation was different, you know, how long I spent underwater. Next question. Go ahead.
Yes, current status of a Spanish, this is a new rule I'm not aware of. What is going on with the Spanish recoveries?
Earlier this evening, we had a conference in another building for people interested in the laws. And the guy who's the expert, where is he? Charles George, right here. He's a maritime lawyer and admiralty arrest lawyer, and he knows all the laws, and he helps make the laws for everybody. And that's part of the discussion we had. What is the status?
Well, Bob, I think where we are now, I think we're in a state of flux here. I believe that the trend, at least for a while, has been to go any kind of work. I think the mic. But for the status quo, the way it is today, it's still being held that what's here, at least in the waters off of Florida, can still be worked. Internationally, it depends on what venue you bring it in, or basically your forum that you bring it in. Let's say you find a ship that's offshore 500 miles, and maybe you can keep it, maybe you can't. But what it really is it's sort of an oppression, you might say, of the freedom of enterprise that most of these, especially there are some really good treasure hunters that are here. These people have devoted their life to this. They've put their life savings into it. Some people have lost people. We all really have. We've all had people die doing this. And they're being oppressed now by a very vocal minority of people who do not believe that treasure salvage should take place. Their idea is that it should be archaeologists only and put into museums. And we see what happens. Look at those beautiful pieces up there. They were in a museum and they disappeared. And if they weren't found by Bob, they would have never been ever seen, because the government, as government mostly does, is inefficient and it can't do it, or it's corrupt. And I think you find that with the Spanish especially. However, there are still countries out there that are willing to let you do what you need to do. It might be their ships, and they're willing to cut a deal with someone to do the salvage work. So I think it's spotty, but as far as the Spanish galleons go, right now we're in a sort of a dark spot. There is a new law, or an addition, or a determination, you might say, of refining of the rules with the Submerged Military Craft Act. We were able last year to stop it, or this year to stop it, but the Democrats slipped through a vote on it on the Senate.
Hey, enough.
Well, put it this way, the Republicans are holding it in the House, so if you really want to preserve freedom of enterprise, you know who you need to vote for. All right, well, thank you.
A couple more questions. If you all want to see real treasure, John Brandon, one of the most successful guys in the business, brought an 80-pound silver bar up here. You can come up and get your picture taken with it. John also brought gold coins to show you. Go ahead.
One more question here.
Yep.
Over here. Of the 14 fleets, how many have been found? Have they found all the 14 of 17, 15?
No.
Fleet?
No.
You found 12?
We're still missing 3 or 4. And remember, in some cases, when these ships wrecked, they broke up in several pieces, dropping a piece here and another piece a half a mile down the road. So, next question.
I have a question. Buzz and I were talking before we came here.
Get that closer to your mouth.
So Spain is saying, if you find a sunken treasure, it's ours. What about the countries they stole it from?
Okay.
May I go next?
About 4 years ago, Spain went to the International Court in The Hague, also known as the World Court, and they got a ruling that all Spanish treasure 50 years or older belongs to Spain. And a lot of people thought that's not going to work. And Odyssey Marine, which my lawyer friend here represents, they went out and found, if you remember, 17.5 tons of gold and silver coins off the coast of Portugal. And then, of course, a big lawsuit and on and on. And in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against them, and the Spaniards sent over 2 big bombers from the Spanish Air Force and took all 17.5 tons of treasure back. So there's none of this finders keepers like in my early days. When I was a kid and I went all these different countries from Peru to Mauritius and the Indian Ocean, I'd go to the government saying, I want to look for treasure in your waters. Which percentage do you want? Do I need permission? Do I have to pay a fee? They all thought you were crazy. Go find what the hell you want, you know? Well, don't try that today. You end up in jail in a lot of countries. I actually, in a lot of places that I work, because a kid deserves the first gold coin he finds, I actually tell him, the first gold coin you find, you steal it, you don't tell me, you don't tell anybody. A couple years down the line, then you can tell anybody you want to. So I could always go back to the government that I'm working, let's say Bahamas or Jamaica or wherever, and say, hey, we didn't steal anything. Because that's the other thing. In countries where I had permits to work and they said, okay, you get 50% of what you find, I don't care how honest you are, they always come around and say, we know you stole some. It's human nature. So are you going to bring that in too? We don't have anything. We didn't steal anything. They don't believe you. So that's their excuse not to divide the treasure with you. I know I get animated when we talk about so many governments have ripped me off.